Thank you very much for that introduction. Very nice. I'm sure you all know by now that Brian is one of the best extempers you'll ever meet and a great person also. So pleasure to be here. I hope everyone's doing well. I'm going to be presenting on a post-COVID world. So imagining what the world will look like whenever COVID is something that we think of in the past. So I'm going to get the slides going. There's definitely going to be enough time for questions at the end. I'm going to have some extemp questions to think about, but if you have a really pressing question, feel free to use the raise hand feature. Put it in the chat. I can't see everyone right now, but I will try to address it as best I can. Okay, so I'm going to get started. So as we all know, COVID-19 has disrupted pretty much every part of our normal lives, and it's hard to imagine a world after COVID or what that world will look like, because as this meme says, nothing is normal right now in 2020. But what I'm going to do in this presentation is give some predictions that, respected experts have made about what a post-COVID world will look like. And I'm going to do that by identifying 3 major trends that I think we'll see in a post-COVID world. And then I'm going to very briefly touch on 2 other trends that I'll just kind of mention. And if you have questions about those 2 others, we can definitely talk about that in the Q&A. So I'm going to get right to the first trend for a post-COVID world, and that would be bigger government. So when COVID is over, governments are going to be a lot bigger than they were before. So Ronald Reagan in America was really the pinnacle of small government conservatism. Ronald Reagan would really hate what's happening with government in response to COVID-19. So that's a fake quote, but people have really been saying stuff like this. Rahm Emanuel, former mayor of Chicago, has said the era of Ronald Reagan that said basically the government is the enemy is over. So we're going to get into why that's happening. So in general, when it comes to governments during crises, they tend to swell, especially economically. So first, the diagram on the left, these are all from The Economist. The one on the left shows social spending, or how much government spend on social programs like healthcare, education, that kind of thing, since the 1800s. As you can see, government spending has exploded because people expect a lot more out of government than they did in, say, the 1700s, the 1800s, or the early 1900s. As that has happened, governments have also had to collect more tax revenue because they have to fund services like healthcare and education. So you can see that in the middle graph. And then the one on the right really speaks to how governments respond to crises. So this is talking about the government of the UK specifically. You can see World War I, World War II, huge spikes in spending because as crises emerge like wars or economic depressions, any type of pressing issue for a country, the government is usually forced to spend more to support citizens, support industry, fund the war effort if it's a war. And oftentimes spending doesn't go back down. Like you'll see that after each world war, spending has continued to increase in Britain from the government. So that's what tends to happen during crisis. But we're going to talk about specifically this COVID-19 crisis, which is obviously a public health crisis, but from this lens, we're talking about it economically. So here's how some major governments have responded to the economic crisis caused by COVID. China, which has been probably one of the lesser hit major economies, representing the second biggest economy in the world, has freed up $80 billion for banks to loan to businesses, which is actually a lot for the Chinese government because the Chinese Communist Party doesn't like big stimulus programs because there's a lot of private and public debt in China. So it's still a lot. Germany, which is also really spending averse, typically likes to have a balanced budget, has committed to 350 billion euros in aid, or 10% of GDP. Japan's relief package was worth $1 trillion, or 20% of GDP. Britain's was worth about 400 billion pounds. And in the United States, you probably know that Congress passed a stimulus package called the CARES Act in March that was worth about $2 trillion in aid. And there was also a subsequent $500 million package. And there's even another one that's passed the House, but probably won't pass the Senate. So the point is, governments are committing millions and billions of dollars, euros, yen, whatever your currency is, to stimulus. Some of this is for businesses. Some of this is for private citizens, like the $1,200 stimulus check in the United States. It's for basically everyone in the country to respond to the economic crisis. So the question is really what the effect of this giant spending will be after COVID-19. But we also don't want to just look at the numbers. We want to look at how that spending is developing. So states aren't just spending big money, they're taking on new responsibilities economically. So when it comes to monetary policy, like interest rates and central banks are essentially promising to buy unlimited amounts of government bonds. Government bonds are essentially buying the government's debt to fund government spending. So when the central bank is buying government bonds, it becomes a lot like the government is kind of printing as much money as it needs to spend, essentially. So that's kind of unprecedented. The US Federal Reserve has pledged to buy a lot of government bonds. The European Central Bank has pledged to pretty much do whatever it takes to keep government solvent. It's pretty much unprecedented. And then when it comes to fiscal policy, like what actual governments can do, tax policy, that kind of thing, governments are bending over backwards to contain the economic fallout. Emmanuel Macron, president of France, has said that no firm will face the risk of bankruptcy because of the pandemic. That's not to say that governments shouldn't offer aid for people who are unemployed or businesses that are losing revenue due to COVID. But the expectations for governments have really changed. In the United States, the government is essentially offering stimulus for businesses to keep workers on the payroll, whereas in places like Britain, the government is paying 80% of people's wages, which is pretty different than any other crisis in the past, where governments were at least willing to accept that during times of crisis, people will become unemployed. Businesses will go out of business. Obviously, that's happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, but governments are absolutely doing everything possible to contain that. So these changes create new expectations. And what that means is when government commits to doing more for citizens, like in the New Deal for the United States, government committed to paying for healthcare and education, people begin to expect that even after the crisis is over. So after COVID-19 ends, citizens may expect governments to make sure that in hard economic times, their businesses keep them on the payroll. They may expect the government to pay their wages. They may expect more progressive economic policies like universal basic income. It's really hard to say, but what's without a doubt is that government is doing a lot more for citizens now, and it's unlikely that they'll take back all of the policy changes that they've made after the crisis ends. So that kind of raises the question, how are governments going to pay for this? They're shelling out a lot of money, and obviously tax revenue is not going to be very high in 2020. People aren't spending. So this graph shows public debt for some major economies. Japan is far and away the most debt-ridden of any major economy. It has over 200% of GDP in debt. But so far, that hasn't really hurt Japan. And essentially, many economists believe that over many decades, inflation will eat away at countries' debt. Countries will get around paying debt because they are the ones that are funding it. A theory called modern monetary theory, which is used kind of on the fringe left on the US spectrum and other really progressive economic thinkers around the world, may gain traction. It essentially says that governments can't go bankrupt because they're the one that produce capital. They're the one that prints the currency. So that could become a more convenient theory for governments as they spend more and more and more. But I don't want to only think economically, though. I also want to look at other forms of power that states are expanding. Citizens tend to trust their government with more non-economic powers during a crisis. This is usually called the rally around the flag effect. A good example of this is the USA Patriot Act of 2001. That was a bill passed just weeks after 9/11 that drastically expanded the government's ability to spy on citizens or access records that were previously private. Another example from a different country is Turkey. In 2016, there was a coup attempt against Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He used that coup to establish a state of emergency that he's essentially extended every year since 2016. And that has been part of a slow climb into authoritarianism there. So in crisis, citizens tend to be okay with governments taking more power. And that's happening during COVID. A good example of this is contact tracing. So Taiwan, South Korea, and Hong Kong all use apps that can essentially track their citizens' phones to conduct contact tracing and to document who has COVID and who doesn't. Israel's security service has also done a similar thing. And in a couple of these countries, this app is voluntary. Like in South Korea, the contact tracing app is voluntary. About half of South Koreans have downloaded it completely voluntarily. But the fear is that data privacy rights, citizens' ability to have privacy from their government, especially when it comes to technology, will erode after COVID-19. And that kind of gets into the next trend I want to talk about, which is rising authoritarianism. So I expect that in a post-COVID-19 world, more countries will tend to shift more towards the authoritarian end of the spectrum rather than expanding democratic freedoms. And we're going to talk about why. So Donald Trump was roundly criticized. I think this was maybe a month and a half ago when he said, when somebody is the president of the United States, the authority is total, and that's the way it's got to be. He received criticism for both ends of the aisle for this statement because we know it's not true. Now, constitutionally, presidents don't have total authority. But in a country where the democratic guardrails might be a little bit less strong, where maybe democracy hasn't been the norm for as long as it has been in the United States, it can be pretty easy for a president or a leader to seek total authority during a crisis. So even before COVID-19, we were kind of already seeing that. Authoritarianism has been on the rise for at least a decade and a half now. So this is a chart from Freedom House. It's a watchdog for democracy, essentially, and it publishes a yearly report on the state of democracy in the world. Each year for the past 3 or 4 years, it's got progressively more fatalistic. The countries in red on this graph are countries that have declined in their overall freedom score, which measures the freedom of citizens. So that's kind of alarming to see before COVID-19. And it's even more alarming considering how much strongmen love the coronavirus, at least now, for a couple of reasons. First, the coronavirus makes it very easy to find scapegoats, which strongmen love. Demographics or opposition groups that strongmen can blame for things. So Viktor Orban in Hungary, who has really expanded the power of Fidesz, his party, has said that there is a certain link between coronavirus and illegal migrants. Not scientifically proven, but he used the coronavirus to scapegoat this group, illegal migrants, that he wants to marginalize. Another reason it's great for strongmen is because coronavirus inspires fear that governments can take advantage of. This is similar to the rally around the flag effect. People will approve of more government spying if they think that it keeps them safe. In Jordan, for example, the government banned the printing of newspapers because they spread the virus. It was met with probably less opposition than it would have been met with if COVID wasn't a thing, because the government can say that newspapers might spread COVID. Again, not scientifically proven, but governments can try to pass it off to expand their powers. And then finally, liberal democracies that might punish countries that slide into authoritarianism, whether with sanctions or condemnation, are otherwise distracted. I think we know that in the United States, COVID-19 is pretty distracted, even though democracy promotion was struggling even before COVID. In other countries like Britain and France, they're also dealing with the coronavirus, so they have less bandwidth to deal with foreign policy and democracy promotion. So as examples of this, we can see a lot of different countries that have already expanded the power of their president or ruling party during the coronavirus, often justified by the coronavirus. So in Hungary, for example, Viktor Orban is ruling by decree, meaning that he can announce any law and it doesn't need parliamentary approval, and there's no expiration date for that, which is kind of alarming. Turkey, 90,000 prisoners are going to be released to avoid spreading COVID-19 in jails. That sounds great, but political prisoners are pointedly excluded. In India, Narendra Modi's BJP party has progressively expanded Hindu nationalism in the past year, and COVID-19 has already accelerated that. The government has been slow to help Muslim people in India receive treatment. Muslims have been persecuted during COVID-19 as they were before, And I think a really alarming example, especially, is Uganda, where police raided a shelter housing 20 gay and transgender people, and they were accused of violating social distancing rules. Social distancing rules can really be a tool for authoritarian governments to persecute, whether it be ethnic minorities, racial minorities, LGBTQ citizens, or even political opposition. It can be very easy for a government to say that the opposing party is meeting, congregating, therefore violating social distancing rules, and thereby do away with the opposition. There's a lot of opportunity for pandemic power grabs, and we're already seeing that. So why does this matter? I mean, obviously, democracy promotion is a key part of many Western nations' foreign policies, but more importantly, for the people in these countries, authoritarianism almost always leads to poor governance, with probably the only real counterexample being China. So firstly, because censorship, a major part of authoritarianism, suppressing information is terrible during a public health crisis. We saw that in China at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, when information was suppressed, that really led to the outbreak in China. One study, I think, found that if China had implemented social distancing and lockdowns 3 weeks earlier, or in other words, if they had followed the initial reports about COVID in Wuhan, they could have prevented around 95% of cases in China. And then another part of authoritarianism, violence, often leads to a militarization of police, which likely will increase civilian deaths. That's not good. And in general, authoritarianism in a public health crisis is not a smart move, because scapegoated minorities like Indian Muslims or LGBTQ people in Uganda will not cooperate with authorities if they fear persecution. And unfortunately, infectious diseases don't discriminate. Indian Muslims and Indian Hindus can spread COVID-19 just as well. So that is alarming for these scapegoated minorities, because they might not reach out for help. If they think they're COVID-19 positive, they might not be able to access treatment, and that leads to further outbreaks. So all in all, it's really alarming for all of these countries when it comes to the pandemic. It's alarming for their citizens after the pandemic. And looking towards the long term, it's worth asking if citizens in countries where their government is becoming more authoritarian will simply sit back and allow it to happen. History suggests that they probably won't. So this is an economist diagram that shows the number of protests by region over the past 10 years or so. As you can see, it's generally increasing, capped off by mass protests in 37 countries in 2019. A lot of these protests are in countries with authoritarian governments that are usurping power. Would not be surprised in the next 5 years to see another wave of protests over authoritarian governments. There have already been scattered protests in China over lockdowns, obviously not allowed to blossom into something larger because of China's government. But in other countries where the government isn't as strong, that could lead to widespread unrest. So look out for that. And then the last major trend I want to talk about before I briefly touch on the other two is fractured international trade. You could also kind of substitute fractured international economy for this. This is kind of going to be talking about the international economy in general. So another Emmanuel Macron quote, he was talking about COVID, and he said that it will change the nature of globalization with which we have lived for the past 40 years. So he's right. The world has lived with globalization for the past 4 decades or so, and COVID-19 is likely to change that. So we have to start, obviously, by defining globalization. The Peterson Institute for International Economics, great source for international econ, calls globalization the growing interdependence of the world's economies, cultures, and populations brought about by cross-border trade in goods and services, technology, and flows of investment, people, and information. So it's how the world becomes more dependent on each other, how countries become more interconnected. And a huge part of that is cross-border trade. It's not the only part of that, but it's the part that we're going to focus on because it's arguably the most affected, apart from movement of people, by COVID-19. So an example of globalization is international supply chains. So the practice of sending different parts for products to different countries, then they're assembled in a final country, then they're shipped to consumers. This shows supply chains for a lot of different products. If we want to narrow down to an especially important product, this is the supply chain for one iPhone. As you can see, it involves a number of countries, including the United States, countries in Europe, and countries in Asia. So global pandemics really don't like international supply chains. But in general, before COVID-19, global trade has been on the upscale. So this is, again, a really large timescale. But as you can see, since 1950, global trade has increased a lot as a percentage of world GDP. But if you want to zoom in very recently, this is just since 1970, you'll see that on this graph, global trade as a percentage of GDP hit a peak at around 2008, and then it fell a lot during the Great Recession, and then it has kind of recovered since then. So this graph tells us two things. One, global trade has already peaked during the 21st century and was not an all-time high before COVID. And two, global trade tends to contract during an economic crisis. So that tells us a lot about what to expect in COVID. But let's actually talk about how the pandemic has affected global trade. So what you really have to know about global manufacturing is that most manufacturing relies on something called global value chains. It just means that raw materials or intermediate goods are shipped around the globe, assembled somewhere, and then exported to consumers. China is at the heart of many global value chains, as you can probably guess, given that China is known for its manufacturing. That's terrible in light of the pandemic because China was the first to lock down, meaning Chinese factories closed, Chinese exports fell, and Chinese demand fell. So if you want to see that graphically, this is industrial production in China. It's been on the up and up since 2000, and then it hits the COVID-19 pandemic in December 2019 and rapidly drops. It's been able to rebound because China was able to quell the virus, but China is still only operating about 85% capacity. And the problem is that even as China has recovered, demand around the world has not recovered. So these are some essential Chinese exports like textiles, technological equipment, electrical equipment, cars. All of them have decreased since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Part of that is factory closures in China, and part of that is falling demand around the world. So that affects global trade. And that has led countries to rethink their reliance on these global value chains. Essentially, the thinking is if a global pandemic can disrupt our supply chains so much, we need to make our supply chains more resilient to international shocks. So countries want to reduce their reliance on these far-flung supply chains. And some countries have already tried to do this. So take France, for example. The finance minister told French companies they should reduce their reliance on China and other Asian nations. In the US, Customs and Border Protection is seizing exports of medical supplies. That seems pretty intuitive. We need medical supplies here. But in the long term, the US will likely move to protect crucial medical supplies that we are reliant on China for. A lot of reagents and crucial ingredients of many medicines can only be sourced right now from China or India. The US will likely try to ramp up domestic production, even if it's more expensive, in the event of a crisis. Japan is probably the biggest example. The Japanese government, as part of its stimulus package, it set aside $2.2 billion to help manufacturers shift out of China. And China comes up a lot here, but kind of like France, it's not only China being hurt by this movement, it's also manufacturing Asian nations like Vietnam and Cambodia. Those countries will benefit in some circumstances as countries move away from China because Vietnam and Cambodia may be cheaper places to produce some goods, but they're also likely to lose out because countries want to have their production as close as possible post-COVID-19. That will probably increase regionalization. So supply chains for the US might not necessarily be in the US, but we probably want them to be in either Mexico or Canada so that they're pretty close. So that will probably increase resiliency, which is good. In the event of another global pandemic, supply chains won't be as disrupted, but also redundancy. The beauty of these far-flung supply chains is that intermediate goods and raw materials arrive just in time at factories. There is no wasted inventory, there is no wasted time, and that reduces inefficiency. That has kind of been the underpinning of globalization and global trade for a lot of decades now. That's probably going to change post-COVID. Another thing to worry about with globalization, we kind of talked about cross-border trade, but cross-border investment is also a big part of globalization. And countries are also cracking down on this. There's the fear that big foreign firms will come and swoop up companies that are really ailing because of COVID-19. And that's led countries to restrict their foreign investment. And I guess I should have said foreign investment can really look like anything. It can be a foreign company building a factory in another country. It can be a foreign company buying another company. It can be opening a store in another country. Really any type of activity in a country that comes from a foreign company or a foreign government. So Germany, Italy, and Spain have all tightened their screening process for foreign direct investment. The Australian government has done the same thing. What this means is that advanced economies are trying to make sure that their businesses aren't swooped up. They're also likely spending less themselves on foreign direct investment. So the International Monetary Fund has said, and this should say $83 billion. There's been an $83 billion capital outflow from emerging markets. So that means that investors in the Western world, US, Europe, are taking their investments out of emerging markets because they want to safeguard their investments in the wake of COVID. That hurts emerging markets. Think of Saudi Arabia, which courts foreign investment a lot. Think of Turkey. Think of a number of rising African economies that are reliant on foreign direct investment, and they've lost a lot of that in the wake of COVID. And for those emerging markets, another thing to think about is remittances. So remittances are when people immigrate to another country, but then send money back to their families or their friends in their home country. Remittances have really been devastated by COVID-19 as well, because people don't have the money to send back to their home countries anymore. So not only are advanced economies going to change a lot when it comes to international trade, I think most of this presentation has been about advanced economies, but emerging markets will also be hurt economically as well. They're losing a lot of foreign direct investment. Their currencies are probably being hit hard by the crisis, which makes it harder to buy goods in dollars or any other currency. So they're not doing well either. So I'm just going to briefly touch on two more trends. I don't have slides for these. I'm kind of just going to discuss them. And if you have questions, feel free to ask at the end. So the fourth trend I was thinking about was great power competition. And this means, obviously, rivalry between great powers. What I was really thinking specifically was the US and China. US-China tensions were already at a high point before COVID-19 due to the trade war, President Trump's attempt to shame China on human rights violations, that kind of thing. And COVID-19 is only worse than that. President Trump has tried to blame China for allowing the virus to enter the United States. China has subsequently responded by saying China was able to contain the virus and the US wasn't. And that will probably only lead to more acrimony in the future. I think China is a really interesting case when it comes to looking at a post-COVID-19 world, because on the one hand, it's almost definitely going to lose out economically by losing some of its manufacturing preponderance and probably never reaching full 100% capacity for at least some years until there's a vaccine. But on the other hand, it's also made a real effort to extend help to other countries in need. It's been sending PPE, sending masks, sending ventilators to countries like Italy, and obviously having photographers there. Whether that soft power boost will offset the shame of suppressing the initial reports of the virus is hard to say. So I think we'll probably be analyzing that, the effect on China, for years to come. But I think what's without a doubt is that US-China competition will be a major part of a post-COVID-19 world. And then the last one, this is kind of a hopeful one. I would hope that in the wake of COVID-19, when countries are able to, they will make a renewed investment in public health. People in government like to say that there is no way to predict the COVID-19 crisis. That is completely wrong. People have been predicting not only a pandemic, because pandemics happen, randomly. We can't predict that. But they've been predicting a very poor response to a pandemic for years. A good example of this, I highly recommend reading the latest issue of Foreign Affairs. It's fittingly called A Post-COVID World, I think. And the lead article is by two public health officials that have repeatedly written about pandemic preparedness in the past. And their requests for more investment have not been met. Countries have not invested in their public in their stockpile of PPE or medical kit, and they haven't been developing contingency plans. Hopefully, in the wake of COVID-19, countries will learn their lesson and prepare for the next pandemic, or else there could be an even worse pandemic. People think that the next influenza pandemic could be much worse than COVID-19 if countries don't prepare. So that's my hope that this will happen. So that's all 5 trends. I have a few really general extent questions for you all to think about. I'm going to share this presentation with Ananth, Brian, Steve. I'm sure they'll get it to you. I don't expect that you would really see questions like this at a tournament, but I think that they're good to think about. Some of them cover things we didn't really discuss, like the dominance of the dollar. We talked about public debt, authoritarianism, the international economy. So I think we tried to answer these questions with this presentation. My hope is that when you go into the next competitive season, you probably will have to speak on a multitude of different countries, and their COVID-19 response will have to be a part of those speeches. Knowing what the world will look like after COVID-19 will help you come up with good points, like rising authoritarianism, bigger government, supply chains. These are all points you'll probably have to use in a COVID speech, because I expect that you all will be talking about COVID probably for the rest of your Extemp career. So, me, Brian, and Steve are kind of just lucky that we got out before this happened. So that's pretty much it. So I guess the rest of the time can just be if anyone has any questions.
Do you recommend any sources to read specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. That reminds me. So I have my source list here for this presentation. A lot of it is The Economist. I think they've done really great reporting on the pandemic in general. Also, just like apart from the pandemic, if you don't read The Economist for Extemp, you should start, because it's truly the Extemper's Bible. Other sources I would recommend, always try to read local sources when you're talking about countries' response to COVID-19. So like if you're reading about the Japanese stimulus package, try to get the Japanese Times. If you're talking about international economics, I love the Peterson Institute personally, and I think Council of Foreign Relations will also remain a really important source for all COVID stuff. So I hope that answers some of your question. So if there aren't any more questions, I think I missed a couple messages in the chat. Yeah, Putin becoming president for life. That's definitely a part of authoritarianism. Thank you for adding that.
Thanks a lot for the lecture. It was great.
Yeah, definitely. It's my pleasure. I'll make sure to share the presentation with Anand. So unless anyone has any other questions, I'll probably let Brian take it away for whatever you're doing next.
I have a quick question. So,
yeah, sure.
In which ways do you think the U.S. might turn to authoritarianism, if that's possible?
Yeah, I think the U.S. is an interesting case because there are very strong guardrails in place. A great source, if you're interested in U.S. authoritarianism, is the book How Democracies Die. I think that there's a fair hope that if Donald Trump doesn't win re-election in November, that some of the informal norms that he's kind of disregarded, for example, like firing inspector generals, not listening to Congress about building a wall, will probably be protected under a Biden administration. The US has such a strong democratic system that it's highly unlikely our democracy will wither into authoritarianism. The bigger concern is that some of the unwritten rules of our democracy, like you should have a fair vote for a Supreme Court nominee, will erode over time. So I would look out for either how Trump acts in a second term or how Biden tries to revitalize American informal norms, and that will probably answer your question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So thank you so much for all listening, and wish you the best of luck with the rest of camp.
Cool. Once again, thank you, Jack. Give him the Zoom claps. I will end the recording now. Fantastic lecture.
Thanks, Brian.